The wind carried dust across the broken field where houses once stood, and the sky looked pale as if it had forgotten how to shine. A young girl walked barefoot among the ruins, her dress torn from days of wandering. She had no food, no home, and no one left to call family. Folks in the nearby towns only whispered about the fire that wiped out the settlement. But no one cared enough to look for survivors. The girl searched anyway, hoping she might find something worth keeping, even if it was just a rusted pan or a piece of cloth to cover her shoulders at night. She hesitated near the remains of an old wagon, where burned wheels lay half buried in dirt. The air smelled of ash and old smoke. She bent down, digging through the debris with both hands. Her fingers were small and rough from work. Yet she kept moving rubble away, as if she believed treasure might be waiting beneath it. Instead of treasure, she found something else. A quiet shape. A body. She froze, heart thumping hard enough to shake her thin frame. At first she thought it was another victim left behind, someone long dead under the open sky. She almost ran, but something in her refused to move. She had seen death before. What lay in front of her did not look lifeless. His chest rose a little, then fell again. She crawled closer, hands shaking. It was a man, tall and strong, even in his weakened state. His skin carried the deep tone of the lands further south. His hair bound with strips of hide, and a single feather sat behind his headband. She recognized the signs from stories told around campfires and distant trading posts. He was Apache. Her breath caught. She had been warned her whole life to stay away from Apache warriors. Folks in town said they rode through valleys like shadows and took down soldiers with arrows faster than bullets. Mothers told children that Apache men never showed mercy. But here he lay on the ground, still wounded, unarmed, and alone. For a moment, she considered leaving him. She could walk away and pretend she never saw him. The world would stay simple that way. A poor girl wandering alone was trouble enough. Helping an Apache might bring worse trouble than hunger or cold nights. Yet she could not ignore the faint rise of his chest, or the way his brow twisted in silent pain. She pressed her hand against her own heart and felt how fast it beat. The ground around him was scattered with broken arrows, saddles and torn blankets, as if a clash had ended right there. The soil was dark with dried blood, though she could not tell whose. She wondered if he belonged to a small band passing through, or if he had been abandoned after a fight. The land had seen many battles, and the ruins hid more history than any child could understand. She knelt beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. His skin felt warm, not cold. She whispered softly, hoping her voice would not startle him. The Apache man did not move. His eyes stayed shut, his lips pressed tight, as if he were fighting something deep inside. She wondered if he had family searching for him, or a village waiting for his return. She wondered if he was feared or loved. She wondered if he had done something to deserve being left behind. A weak groan slipped from his throat. The girl flinched back, startled. The sound made him seem real, no longer just a shape on the ground. She leaned closer and tried again, brushing dirt from his chest. His clothes were torn and marked with cuts, and she saw a long gash along his ribs. She had nothing to treat wounds with, no water, no cloth, except her own ragged dress. She pressed gently on his chest, trying to wake him enough to breathe easier. He moved at last. His fingers twitched, gripping the earth as though he were ready to rise and fight again. His eyes opened just enough to see her face. He stared at her, silent and tense, as if unsure whether she was a threat. She did not move. She held her ground, though fear crawled up her spine. His gaze softened for a moment, then dropped shut again. His strength was fading fast. She looked around the empty field. The world seemed too far from help. Townsfolk would never welcome someone like him, and even if they did, bringing him there would put her at risk. Travelers would see him as dangerous. Soldiers would see him as an enemy. She had to make a choice: leave him or help him. She placed both hands on his chest again and whispered that she would not harm him. She promised quietly, though he could not hear her. The girl pulled at the band around his head and tried to lift him enough to sit upright, but he fell back with a soft gasp. His weight was too much for her small arms, yet she refused to stop helping. She used strips from the bottom of her dress to wrap the wound, tying knots with shaking fingers. The sky darkened while she worked, and a cold wind blew across the plains. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the land fell quiet. She looked over her shoulder often, afraid that someone might appear and see her kneeling beside a wounded Apache man. If anyone found them together, she might be seen as helping an enemy. A poor girl from the ruins would have no one to defend her. The thought made her heart tremble, but she stayed. He opened his eyes a second time. This time, he lifted his hand weakly and placed it on her wrist. His voice came out rough and faint, speaking in words she did not fully understand. She watched his face carefully, trying to catch meaning from his expression alone. His eyes were sharp despite his pain, holding a silent warning and silent trust at the same time. Like a man who had lived through storms far greater than the one he lay in now. She leaned closer, trying to understand him better. He tried to speak again, but his breath broke and he fell quiet. His hand dropped from her wrist, landing on the rocky soil. She caught it gently, afraid he might slip away if she let go. A distant rumble sounded in the valley below. Hooves. More than one horse. She turned her head, heart jumping. Whoever was coming rode with purpose. Dust rose behind the distant riders. She looked back at the wounded Apache. Then toward the empty horizon where help might come or danger might arrive. She stood between him and the sound. Small, but determined. Knowing this moment would change everything, and the riders kept getting closer. The girl pressed her, hand against the Apache man's shoulder, urging him to stay down. She did not fully know why she did it. Maybe because she feared what would happen if the riders saw him. Maybe because she did not want to lose the first living soul she had found since the fire. He looked up at her again, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but he seemed to understand the worries shaping her face. He settled lower against the ground and tried to steady his breathing. The sound of horses grew louder. She ducked behind a broken wall, dragging a torn blanket over the man to hide the bright feather that marked who he was. The horses came fast, kicking dust that rolled into the air like a small storm. The girl crouched low, heart pounding in her ears. She did not dare breathe too loudly. 3 men rode into the ruins, their clothing marked by travel and their faces covered with grit. They looked around, searching through the collapsed walls and burnt frames of what once were homes. One rider dismounted and kicked at the wreckage with his boot. The girl watched them through a crack in the broken boards, praying they would not look her way. These were ranch riders. She could tell by the leather belts, ropes, and rifles they carried. They were the kind of men who did business with soldiers and landowners. They would never lift a hand to save someone like her. The tallest rider pointed at the ground ahead. There were tracks, prints left from horses and people before the battle. The riders followed the trail, scanning the area carefully. The girl feared they would come close enough to see the Apache warrior hidden behind her. She bit down on her lip and stayed still as stone. One rider stopped just a few steps away. He turned his head, sharp eyes cutting across the ruin. The girl felt a shiver run through her. His hand hovered near his rifle as if he sensed danger nearby. At last, he jerked his reins and swung back into his saddle. He muttered something under his breath and signaled the others to move on. The riders took off toward the valley. Dust thinned slowly after them. The moment they vanished from sight, the girl let out the breath she had been holding. Her legs trembled from the fear that had traveled up from the earth beneath her feet. She waited a while longer and crawled back to the man she had promised to help. He had watched as much as he could through half-open eyes. When she returned, he looked more aware, though still weak. She whispered that the riders were gone, hoping he might understand her tone, if not her words. The Apache man nodded faintly. He touched his side where the wound stretched across his ribs. His breath came shallow, pain deepening the lines on his face. The girl knew she needed water to clean the wound. There had been a spring nearby when the settlement was still alive. She remembered her mother fetching buckets from that place. If it still flowed, it could help him. But leaving him alone felt risky. If he slipped away, or those riders returned, she would regret not staying. But if she did not get water, he might not last until night. She lifted the edge of the blanket and checked the knot she had tied earlier. It held, though the blood had darkened her cloth. She told him she would return soon. He stared at her as if weighing his trust, then shut his eyes again, the fight draining from him once more. She stepped carefully over the fallen beams, heading toward the old spring. As she walked, memories crept back like shadows rising behind her. She had lived here once, back when laughter filled the air and bread baked in ovens. Her mother would hum while kneading dough on the wooden table, and her father would come home with pockets full of grain and a tired but proud smile on his face. She remembered laughter under warm lantern light and stories told by visitors stopping by for a meal. Then the fire came. Not from nature, but from men. Flames rose as high as trees. Screams cut through smoke. She remembered clutching her sister's hand, running toward the fields. She remembered her father pushing them through the tall grass. After that, her memories blurred. She woke the next morning alone, ash all around her, with no sign of the life she once knew. The spring still trickled from beneath a rock and formed a muddy pool that smelled of earth. She knelt down to collect water in her cupped hands. She drank quickly, then filled a broken tin she found nearby. It was dented but could hold enough to bring back. On her way back, she felt the weight of silence stronger than ever. The ground, the wind, even the birds seemed to watch her choices. When she reached the Apache man again, he was awake. He looked like he was fighting to stay conscious. She dipped her cloth into the water and touched his wound with slow care. His jaw tensed, but he did not push her hand away. She told him that this was all she had. He looked at her face as if trying to understand not just her words, but her heart too. She saw strength behind his pain, a strength that once stood firm in battles she could not imagine. She wondered what brought him here, who he had been before he fell among the ruins. Was he a leader, a fighter, a protector of his people? The girl noticed something hanging around his neck. A small, carved piece of wood, shaped with great care. It showed a symbol she had never seen, though it looked important. A mark of honor or belonging. She traced it lightly with her fingers, then pulled her hand away, feeling like she had touched something sacred. As the day moved on, the Apache man tried to speak again. He formed words slowly, and although she could not understand all of them, she caught enough to know he had been separated from his group. There had been a fight more violent than she had first realized. Men from the hills attacked. Some wore uniforms, some wore hats like hunters. He had been outnumbered. The girl listened with wide eyes, learning how fragile the land between settlers and tribes had become. Fear and anger had torn everything apart. He paused often to catch his breath, and she waited patiently each time. She did not rush him. She knew what loss felt like, and the way he looked toward the distance told her his heart was also searching for someone he cared about. Evening settled over the ruins like a heavy blanket. The girl gathered sticks and tried to start a small fire with stones, but she had little skill for it. At last a small flame flickered, giving light and warmth. She shared the bread crust she carried with her, and even though the Apache man could barely eat, he accepted a piece out of respect. Far off in the darkness, the sound of horses returned. This time, many more. The girl stiffened. The Apache man's eyes widened just enough to show worry. He tried to push himself upright, but his body failed him, and he fell back. The girl shook her head and urged him not to move. Voices echoed through the valley, louder than before. Lanterns glowed between distant rocks. Whoever was coming, they were searching with greater purpose now. The girl's heart raced. She looked around, thinking desperately of where to hide him, how to keep him safe, how to keep herself safe. She touched his arm again, hoping he could feel some comfort through her trembling fingers. He closed his eyes, as if saying he trusted her now. That made her chest tighten with a strange new feeling. She barely understood why she cared so much, but she did. The fire was too risky. She stomped it out quickly, letting smoke drift away into the night. She listened, counting each hoofbeat as it moved closer. She scanned the broken walls for a hiding place, any corner deep enough to keep the Apache warrior unseen until danger passed. But the ruins felt smaller with every step the riders took. She stood between him and the advancing voices, just as she had earlier, but now the fear sparked into a protective fire inside her. She would not let them take him. Not after she chose to save him. Not after she realized he was the only living person left in her shattered world. The rider's lanterns appeared at the edge of the ruins. Shadows stretched toward her, as if they already reached for the man she tried to hide. She braced herself, holding her breath, waiting for what would happen next, knowing that the moment their eyes landed on them, everything would change once again. The lanterns moved slowly through the ruins, casting long shadows across broken stone and burnt timbers. The girl pressed her back against the wall, keeping her body in front of the wounded Apache man. The riders dismounted, their boots crunching over gravel as they spread out. They whispered to each other in sharp tones, the kind men use when hunting something they have already tracked for miles. She listened without breathing. They talked about signs on the ground, blood marks leading toward the valley, broken weapons scattered across the earth. One man said they were close. Another said they should check deeper near the ruins where the fire had burned hottest. The girl felt a tremor move through her arms. She crouched lower, tightening her grip on a piece of wood she picked from the ground. It was not much of a weapon, but it made her feel less helpless. The Apache man lay behind her, silent, eyes half open, muscles strained as if he wanted to rise, but knew he could not. She placed her hand on his chest to keep him down. Her touch was gentle, but firm enough to show she understood the danger. A voice from outside the broken wall called out, asking if anyone saw movement. The girl swallowed hard. She thought of running into the night, leaving the warrior behind. Her life would be easier if she slipped away unseen. Yet every time she considered leaving, her heart tightened like a rope being pulled from both ends. She stayed. A rider walked closer, boots scraping stone. He stopped so near she could see the pattern of stitching on his coat through the cracks in the wall. He raised his lantern and shined the light across the ground. The girl pressed the Apache man's hand against the dirt, signaling him to stay still. The lantern beam drifted away, then returned, lingering only inches from where they hid. The rider stared at the ruins, rubbing his chin, thinking hard. At last he turned away, calling out to his companions that they should check the ridge before dawn. Hooves thundered again as they rode off, leaving dust and silence behind them. The girl stayed frozen until she could no longer hear their horses. Only then did she release her breath, shoulders falling as the fear loosened its grip. The Apache man whispered something, voice low and uneven. She knelt near him, trying to understand. His words carried a mix of gratitude and warning. He told her there were men from both sides who hunted without mercy. Not all wore uniforms, not all belonged to his tribe. Some chased land, some chased revenge, some chased bounties. He had crossed paths with them all. She listened closely, realizing the world she once knew was far wider and more dangerous than she understood from behind her parents' cabin walls. He spoke of his own people, though not in full detail. He mentioned a group led by someone respected, someone he needed to return to. His voice lowered when he spoke the name, showing it meant more than just a leader. The girl noticed he avoided speaking about the battle that left him wounded. It was as if he carried something heavy inside, something unfinished that pulled him toward danger again. Night settled deeper. The girl gathered what little remained of usable planks and stones, building a small shelter around him. She worked quietly, careful not to draw attention. She wished she had tools or blankets, but all she had was determination. He watched her without speaking, eyes tracing every move she made. She could feel his gaze, not suspicious, but curious, as if trying to understand why a girl with nothing kept choosing to help him. When the shelter was finished, she sat beside him, hugging her knees to keep warm. He studied her hands, noticing the scars from farm work. He touched one gently, then pulled his hand away, showing respect for her space. She wondered what he saw in her that made him stay calm. She wondered what she saw in him that made her risk everything. The land grew quiet again, but beneath the silence lay tension like a storm, waiting to break. She knew the riders would return. They had not given up, and if they came back with more men, hiding would not be enough. The girl could not sleep. She watched the sky turn darker, then pale with dawn. When the first light spread across the ruined land, the man tried once again to sit up. She jumped forward, helping support his back. He leaned against a stone, breathing hard. Though he was weak, she could see strength returning to his eyes, like fire catching fresh air. He pointed toward the horizon, signaling that they could not stay here. He needed to reach safer ground, and she needed to move if she wanted to survive alongside him. She hesitated. This was her home, even if nothing remained. Leaving meant accepting that everything from her old life was gone. But staying meant being trapped between men with guns and memories that brought no comfort. She looked at the warrior again, seeing something in him she could not ignore. He had purpose. She needed that more than she ever realized. She placed his arm over her shoulder and helped him rise. They took slow steps away from the ruins, moving toward a stretch of land covered in tall grass. Each step showed how far he still had to go before he could stand on his own. They stopped often, resting behind rocks and dry shrubs. The girl kept glancing back, expecting riders to appear any moment. By midday, they reached a small ravine where water trickled through a narrow channel. The warrior drank deeply, then washed dust from his face. She watched him silently, seeing how his spirit lifted with each breath of fresh water. When he finished, he looked at her with grateful eyes, then pointed toward distant hills where his people might be. She shook her head. The journey was long, and he was still wounded. He understood her worry, but his face hardened with quiet resolve. Whatever waited for him beyond the hills mattered enough to risk moving forward. She wondered if he carried important news, or if someone depended on his return. She wondered if anyone was looking for him the way she once wished someone would look for her, before they could decide what to do next. A sudden noise echoed across the ravine. The girl grabbed his arm and pulled him behind a boulder. Hooves again. Closer than before. This time, there were more voices, louder and angrier. Someone shouted orders, demanding riders spread out and search every valley. These men were not passing through. They were hunting deliberately now. The girl pressed her forehead against the cool stone, trying to steady her breath. She felt the Apache man's hand rest on her shoulder. Even weak, he held himself ready, watching the ravine with sharp eyes. He murmured something low, telling her not to run blindly. She nodded, though her instincts begged her to flee. The riders entered the ravine slowly. Their horses stepped into the shallow water, kicking ripples across the surface. The men spoke about tracks leading north, about footprints too small to belong to a warrior. One man guessed a child had guided him. Another laughed, saying no child would dare help someone like him. Their voices grew sharper. One man swore that if they found the warrior, they would drag him back alive so he could answer for the trouble he caused. The girl felt anger stirring inside her at the cold way they spoke of him, as if he were less than human. She looked at his face and saw him listening with clenched jaw and steady eyes. He did not fear them. He simply waited for the right moment. The riders paused near the edge of the ravine. One man pointed toward the tracks leading upward. They followed the trail once more, though now their eyes searched even harder. The girl stayed still until the last rider disappeared beyond the grass. When silence returned, the warrior tried to stand again. He looked toward the hills, then at her, as if asking whether she would choose to continue with him or stay behind. She knew he could not force her, and she knew she did not owe him anything. But she also knew that something inside her had shifted since the moment she found him among the ruins. She rose to her feet, brushed dirt from her hands, and nodded without speaking. The warrior lifted his chin slightly, honoring her decision. They stepped deeper into the grasslands, heading toward a future neither could clearly see. While behind them, the riders circled like wolves who were not ready to give up. Far ahead, thunderclouds gathered, dark and heavy, signaling that the land would soon face more than men on horseback. The wind picked up and carried distant war cries across the open plains, sounds that neither of them expected to hear. And just as they started walking, the girl realized they were no longer the only ones in the valley. Someone else was watching from the ridge. Someone silent, hidden, waiting. The conflict was only beginning. The wind pushed the tall grass aside as the girl, the wounded Apache, moved farther from the ravine. Each step across the open plains made her feel smaller, as though the land itself tested their strength. The warrior leaned on her shoulder when he could no longer walk straight, and she steadied him with both arms. His weight slowed them, but she refused to let him fall again. The sky darkened until heavy clouds turned the world into a silent shadow. Thunder rolled across the hills, warning them of a storm closing in. He pointed toward a distant rock formation shaped like a broken spear. Beneath it, the land dipped into a narrow path that could hide them from riders. She nodded and pushed forward, though her legs ached from hours of walking. When they reached the shelter of the rocks, rain began to fall, first in small drops, then in steady waves that soaked her dress and filled the air with the scent of wet soil. The warrior sank to the ground. Back resting against the stone, rain washed dried blood from his skin, trailing red lines down his ribs. The girl cupped her hands to catch fresh water and pressed it to his lips. He drank slowly, then closed his eyes, gathering enough strength to speak. His voice was clearer now, though still quiet. He told her he could not turn back, not until he reached the valley where his people had moved. He mentioned that a group of families, elders and children, had left days before the battle. If the riders found them first, there would be no one to defend them. She listened with wide eyes. Until now, she had only known her own losses. Hearing about others who might be in danger stirred something deeper inside her. She realized this journey was no longer just about saving one wounded warrior. It was about reaching a place where lives depended on him. And now on her too. The storm hid them for a while, but it also brought danger. Lightning struck near the ridge, its flash revealing a lone rider watching them from afar. The girl gasped and pulled closer to the warrior. The rider did not move, only sat on the horse, letting the rain hit his coat. When he finally turned away, he rode slowly, almost calmly, as though he did not want to spook them. But his presence alone warned her that the chase was not over. Night fell again, this time colder. The girl gathered branches blown from trees by the storm, building a small fire beneath the rock to warm the warrior. The flames flickered against the stone, lighting his face. She watched the scars on his arms, marks of battles she could not imagine. He sat upright now, breathing more steadily. He thanked her again, not with long words, but with a quiet nod that carried respect. She told him pieces of her past as the fire crackled. She spoke of her family, her small cabin, the morning she woke alone after the fire. His expression tightened, not out of pity, but because he understood what it meant to lose everything. He told her she carried a brave heart, though she shook her head. Saying bravery felt more like fear that never left. He reached for the small carved piece, hanging from his neck, and placed it in her hand. The wood felt smooth and warm. It showed two crossed shapes meeting under a rising sun. He explained that it was not just a sign of his people, but a mark carried only by those sworn to protect the weak and keep balance between warring lands. She stared at the symbol, surprised that fate had brought such a man to her feet in the ruins. Before she could speak, voices echoed through the night. Torches burned in the distance, moving like small orange stars across the land. The riders had spread out again. This time, they were close enough that she could hear their horses snort and their saddles creak. She tossed dirt over the fire, smothering the flames. Darkness swallowed them as she pressed her back against the warrior's shoulder. Listening as the riders fanned out across the rocks, one torch passed within throwing distance. The rider carrying it looked tired, his coat dripping water. He scanned the rocks before turning to shout to the others that they should search lower trails. Hooves thundered away. But before the girl could relax, she heard a horse approaching from behind the boulders. A different rider crept closer, torch lowered. He did not call out like the others. He moved with caution, searching for someone who he already suspected was hiding. The girl held her breath as the warrior pulled her closer, his arm gently shielding her. She felt his muscles tighten, ready even in weakness. The rider stopped so near that she could hear him breathing. He leaned forward, examining footprints in the mud. His torch lit the ground where the girl and the warrior had walked minutes earlier. He followed the tracks slowly, step by step. Heading straight toward their hiding place, the girl felt the world shrink around her. She looked to the warrior, waiting for him to give a sign. His eyes narrowed and he whispered something short. She did not know the meaning, but she understood one thing clearly. If they were discovered now, neither of them would get another chance to reach the valley. Before the rider reached them, a sharp howl echoed from the far side of the ridge. Wolves answered the storm, and the horses below panicked. Riders shouted, pulling their reins and backing away. Hooves stumbled against slippery rock. The lone rider turned his horse toward the sound, distracted long enough for the girl and the warrior to slip deeper into the shadows. The storm eased by dawn, but danger did not. They continued moving north, the warrior walking now without needing her shoulder. His steps remained slow, yet steady. The land changed as they traveled. Dry plains gave way to cliffs and brush that reached the foothills of distant mountains. Each mile carried them closer to his people, but also deeper into contested land where soldiers and hunters set traps at midday. They found tracks in the dirt, small and many. The warrior crouched, observing them with sharp eyes. He told her these belonged to children, elders, and women traveling together. The prints were fresh. Relief softened his features for a moment, then worry replaced it. The group had moved quickly, likely driven by fear. They followed the tracks, passing through narrow canyons where echoes hid footsteps, and across dried riverbeds where sunlight caught shards of broken pottery. The girl wondered if these belonged to camps forced to move again and again, never settling long enough to rebuild their lives. She felt a strange bond with people she had never met, bound not by blood, but by loss. As twilight settled, they reached a ridge where smoke rose from a distant valley. The warrior's eyes widened with hope. He stepped forward, but she grabbed his arm. Smoke could mean safety, but it could also mean attack. He nodded slowly, understanding the caution she carried. They watched from the ridge. The valley below looked peaceful, dotted with tents and small fires that glowed softly. Children ran between the shadows, elders sat near fires, and men stood guard with bows at their sides. The warrior exhaled with deep emotion, his eyes shining. He had found his people, but he did not go to them. Instead, he pointed to the far end of the valley, where another camp waited, hidden behind trees. Riders approached that camp from opposite hillsides. The girl counted the horses, recognizing figures from the ruins. These were the same men who had chased them for days. They were closing in from two sides, waiting for darkness to fall before striking. The warrior clenched his fists. His people were safe for the moment, but unaware of the danger creeping toward them. If the attack came, families would be trapped between both groups of riders. The girl looked at him, understanding without needing words. This was the moment everything had been leading to. He stood tall, despite his wounds. She reached for the carved symbol at his neck. He touched her hand, eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. She knew he was ready to fight, even if he barely survived the last battle. She also knew she could not let him stand alone. The valley waited below. Unaware that both danger and hope stood together on the ridge, the girl took a step beside him, ready to follow him into whatever came next. Even if it meant facing the same men who burned her life to ashes. And just as they prepared to move, the sound of distant drums echoed across the hills, a signal none of them expected. Turning the night into a rising storm of fate, the drums echoed across the hills like distant thunder, calling every heartbeat in the valley to wake. The girl stood beside the Apache warrior, both watching the lanterns move from ridge to ridge as riders closed in on the camp below. For a moment, she felt the weight of her journey pull tight around her chest. She had spent days hiding, running, and doing everything she could just to keep one wounded man alive. Now she stood on the edge of a moment that could save not just him, but an entire camp of families who had fled too many times already. The warrior placed his hand over the carved piece at his chest and whispered words that sounded like a vow. Strength returned to his voice in a way she had not heard since the first night. He looked down at the valley as though every person below was part of his blood. Then he turned to her and nodded. It was not a farewell or a command. It was a sign that he wanted her beside him, not behind him. They moved down the slope, weaving through brush and narrow trails until they reached the edge of the camp. A young boy spotted them first and called out. Warriors stepped forward, bows raised, ready to protect their families. The girl froze, unsure of her place. But the wounded man walked past her and raised his hand in a greeting that carried both rank and history. The guards lowered their weapons at once. A woman ran forward and touched his face with trembling hands. She looked relieved and scolded him all in one breath. The girl stepped back to give them space, feeling both comfort and loneliness as she watched people who still had one another. Children gathered around her, eyes wide. They tugged at her dress and asked where she came from. She answered softly that she came from the ashes on the plains and found a man who needed help. The children listened as if her words carried magic. One of them placed a small woven band in her hand, a quiet sign of welcome. When night settled fully, leaders of the camp gathered around a fire to speak with the warrior. He told them about the riders, how they had tracked him from the ruins, and how they now closed in on both ends of the valley. The elders listened with calm faces, but their eyes darkened with concern. They had carried too many families to new lands, only to be chased again. They knew they could not run forever. The girl sat on the edge of the firelight while the warrior spoke. She watched him rise to his feet, standing tall despite his injuries. He spoke with conviction, offering a plan that used the hills and narrow trails to guide families to safer ground before the riders swept in. His voice carried the weight of someone who had fought not for pride, but for those who depended on him. The elders agreed, though the plan required quick action and bravery from everyone. The camp moved silently under the moon. Fires were smothered, tents taken down, and children carried on shoulders. The girl helped gather bundles, walking beside families she had never met, but already cared for. The warrior guided the group toward a narrow pass hidden by brush. He walked with purpose, though every step reminded him of wounds not fully healed. Before the families cleared the valley, the riders finally appeared at the ridge. Lanterns glowed like angry eyes. The girl could hear their voices shouting orders to split into two groups. She held a young child close, while the warrior signaled to a group of scouts, who moved swiftly through the shadows to mislead the riders. The scouts rode in circles, leaving fresh tracks to draw attention away from the families. Horses thundered past, chasing dust instead of people. The girl waited in the pass with the others. She watched the warrior ride out with a handful of men to keep the riders off, their trail long enough for everyone to reach safety. She wanted to call out to him, to ask him not to go, but she held her words inside. Sometimes the strongest support came from trusting someone to finish what they were meant to do. The clash of hooves and shouts echoed across the valley. The girl closed her eyes and prayed for the battle to end without blood. She held the carved symbol tightly, feeling its shape press into her palm. When the echoes faded at last, silence took hold once more. Moments later, the warrior returned, tired but unbroken. Dust covered his face and his arm hung at his side, but there was no sign of defeat in his steps. The riders had scattered, realizing they could not reach the families before dawn. The camp had moved beyond the hills, and the riders refused to chase through narrow canyons and darkness. For the first time in days, the warrior allowed himself to breathe freely. The sun rose over a new stretch of land, painting the sky with calm colors. Families settled in a meadow beside a stream. Children played in the water. Elders rested beneath trees, and the camp felt less like a group running from danger and more like a community finally finding a place to breathe. The girl stood apart, watching the new day unfold. She knew she could walk away now. Her life was no longer tied to ruins or empty fields. She had helped carry someone back to where he belonged. She could choose any path forward. But as she turned to leave, the warrior approached her. He thanked her not only for saving his life, but for saving the people he loved. His words were slow and simple, but they carried a depth that reached her heart. He told her she no longer needed to wander alone. If she wished, she could stay. The camp needed hands that understood hardship, and she needed a place where her past no longer defined her. She looked across the meadow, seeing not strangers but faces that had already woven her into their circle. She thought of the night she wrapped her torn dress around his wound, the moment she stood in front of riders to protect him, and the long road they had traveled together. She slipped the carved piece back into his hand. He shook his head and closed her fingers around it instead. She understood he was not giving her a token, but inviting her into a future shaped not by loss, But by purpose she stayed. In time, she built a small shelter near the stream, working alongside others to raise new homes. She helped gather roots, prepare food, and care for children whose parents hunted or stood watch. The warrior's strength returned fully, and he carried himself as a protector once more. When he passed by her, he always paused long enough to speak, to listen, or to share quiet silence. The connection between them grew not from one moment but from every moment after. Seasons changed. Green hills turned golden, winds softened, and laughter filled the valley like music made from ashes turned to life. The girl no longer felt like the poor child who crawled through ruins in search of scraps. She had found something greater than survival. She had found belonging. One evening, as orange light faded behind the mountains, the warrior stood beside her at the stream. He told her there were still hard days in the world, still battles in distant places, still riders who believed land could be claimed by force. But he also told her that courage could rise from the unlikeliest souls. He said she proved that. She leaned against him, watching water flow past her feet. He placed his hand over hers, not to claim her, but to walk alongside her. Her journey had begun with ashes, but it ended with hope. And though the world beyond the valley still held dangers, she no longer faced them alone.